Hi, I'm Doug, your tech support representative for Atlantic British, and what we have here is a 97 Defender with a 4-liter GEMS engine that's in need of valve cover gaskets. So what we're going to do is essentially give you the procedure you're going to need to get down to the point where you can remove the valve covers, change the gaskets, and reassemble the engine. Now, we've already done some minor disassembly on this for another video involving the heater hoses and one of the elbows, which you can refer back to that video. It is listed on our online website, and that'll show you how to take the hoses off. That's a relatively simple procedure. At this point, what we're going to do now is we're going to remove the upper intake plenum so that we can access the driver's side valve cover, and remove the hoses and part of the harness and the fuel lines on the opposite side. Show you how to access that passenger side. So let's start with the upper plenum, and what we've got is your throttle linkage, your breather hose, several of your sensors like your throttle position sensor and your idle air control motor, which is controlled by the ECM and operates off a vacuum. We'll pop that hose up. We're actually going to replace that hose. So you start finding hoses very dry and very hard to remove. They've kind of lost their flexibility. You certainly want to replace it. Now, this would be the connector for the idle air control motor, and this is just a matter of peel this tab back. That will pop off there. This is your throttle position sensor, and you're going to push in on that middle retainer and pull down. That takes the two off. And we'll take the screw off for the air intake tube from the air filter. And it's a good idea at this point, while you're under the hood and whatnot, once you get that off, we're going to take the air intake, make sure this is clear of debris, and take a look at your air filter and see what condition that's in. You can never have too clean an air filter. It makes a huge difference in your fuel economy and in your performance. Slide that back. Put the clamp to the side because I'm sure we're going to drop that. Push the tube down and get that out of the way. And we've got a couple hoses here, and these are quick release hoses. And you'll see two ears sticking out of the connector. What we're going to do is compress those gently and wiggle this off. You can see we've got some rust developing around the nipple that this plugs into. Get a little crocus cloth or some emery and just clean that off a little bit, and that'll give you a better connection when you put it back together. And then we also have, for the vacuum line for the power brake booster, same type of connector, and we're going to depress those ears. This one's a little bit more difficult to get at, so be patient. Tuck that down out of the way. Now, we have two coolant hoses. Under the throttle body you have a heater that's basically warmed up with flow from warm coolant. One running from the radiator to the heater, and then back out of the heater, this small hose that takes you down into the intake manifold. Now, they're kind of difficult to get at in this position. Normally what I do, you can do this one of two ways. When you are done with your disassembly and you're ready to take this off, you can leave the two hoses on the intake and simply disconnect the lower clamp at the intake for one hose and the other at the radiator, and these are much more accessible. Or what you can do is, once you unbolt the plenum, leaving these two connected, you can lift up and then remove the clamps. I find it's easier just to do these two and take the hoses off with the intake. So back the clamps off on those. And again, if the clamp gives you a hard time, if it binds up, if it started to rust to the point where it makes it difficult, I would definitely replace that clamp. Because when you do tighten it, you want to make sure you have a good seal. You don't need any leaks when you're done. One. They come off relatively easy. We got a wire tie there. Now these two plastic lines, this is a note from the vacuum booster and from the brake booster, the two with the disconnects. They're plastic, and over a period of time, just from the heat that's developed in the under the hood, they get hard and brittle. So be a little gentle as you handle them. They can, when they get old and brittle, I think these have been replaced before, but originals could get brittle and very easily break off and snap. So you want to be careful when operating them, so taking them off and moving them. Now, let's see if we get our fingers down in there. I'm going to need a little bit more on that clamp. Just something I'm going to note on the Defenders, because you have aluminum fenders and they're relatively flat on top. You'll notice always have a fender cover, and I've even made cardboard cutouts to sit on top of the fenders, not just to protect the paint, but if you happen to put a force or too much weight, they can easily bend and leave an impression. Aluminum is very soft. So make yourself some cardboard cutouts, and in the end you'll you'll greatly appreciate it. Okay. Now, these hoses are a little swelled and soft, so after we get them off, we're going to replace them. And these are essentially can be just done with bulk hose. I believe these are a 5/16 inner diameter. They're getting a little dried out. Definitely time to change. Now, we get over to the throttle linkage. You have a small cotter pin, and that holds in the pivot pin for the throttle cable. So we're going to bend the ears back over, straighten the pin out. Now, some of these can get pretty rusted in place. Pre-soaking it with penetrating oil, or just simply breaking the pin off and then pushing this through and then just replacing it might be an option. See, like in this case, that pivot pin is in there pretty good. That's probably never been removed. We'll let that soak a minute while we're taking the transmission kickdown off. Now that's a completely different setup. You'll find you have a clamp you'll see over the back of the line, and that's actually part of the pin that slides through. You're going to lift up on that tab and unclip it. Alright, you swivel that up and then slide the pin out. Now, what I would suggest doing is put the pin back in place and clamp it. Then you're not looking for it later when you go to put this back together. The throttle cable is held in by this knurl, which this is actually an adjuster, and will bring the throttle cable in or out because you want to have a little bit of play when you reassemble it, but essentially just pops out of this mounting bracket, and we're going to pop that out once we get that pin out. We're going to let that soak for a minute yet, and then we're going to take this nut off the back of the transmission kickdown. We're going to take that nut off the end of the cable, and then there's a slot on the side which will allow us then to slide the cable partially out and away from the bracket. Alright, so we got a 13 millimeter on there. Now this is moving fairly free. Alright, so what we did is we shot some penetrating oil on this pivot pin for the throttle cable, let it soak for a bit, took the transmission off, and what we've done is we've taken a small needle nose pair of vice grips and then just simply hold this down and then work it back and forth, and you can see it did break itself free. And we'll run that up to clear that out. I'll slide that pin out. And voila, and let that penetrate and it'll do its job there. Now to get the cable out of the bracket, you'll see all you've got basically your little compression tabs on the back side, and you can get that out just by wiggling that around, and that'll take the throttle cable off. So we have our sensors disconnected, our breather tube, our vacuum line here. Alright, so you're going to remove this. And this is your vacuum line to the pressure regulator for fuel, which is right there. Now, if we go around to the other side, we actually have one vacuum line. All right, we have six 6mm Allen head bolts that hold this upper plenum to the lower. There's actually two pieces to the upper that you'll see once we get the cover off. There's actually 6 intake snorkels, so to speak, inside of this that can also be removed, but we don't need to get to the valve cover. The only reason we're taking this off is because of this overhang from the throttle body and the intake. Crack them loose and give them a spin. We have all 6 unbolted. Take care when you lift them up because they're going to have a flat washer underneath the head of the bolt. You can see I've already dropped one, which we'll get that once we take the plenum off. Also notice some of the bolts are different lengths. So as you pull them out, take note of what length came out of what hole. Little pop on the turn this to the side, because what we have is a bracket right here that holds onto the snorkel of the airline air intake tube. Let's see if we can sneak that out of there. That we're going to have to take the bracket off. No, that's got to come off. Alright, so easiest way, as you can see, it's nut and bolt. I believe either 10 or 11mm. We got 10mm nut and bolt. Of course, this would certainly be easier with an air tool, but we're going to do this by hand. That's because I believe some of you will be doing that as well. And just crack it loose, and I should be able to spin that off by hand. It's just easier taking the 2 bolts off as opposed to fooling around with that clamp down there and possibly bending it so you won't be able to get it back together properly. So now the bracket's off and we remove the upper intake. Now you'll notice there's no gasket. What they do is use a sealer. Now somebody's used a varnish sealer on here, which you can see openings and areas where you had no seal whatsoever. So it really isn't the approved method to reinstall this, and we'll cover that when we put this back together, and we'll show you what the right sealer to use is. Alright, so now we're down to, we've got the upper intake off, we have access to this driver's side valve cover, and what we're going to do is we're going to have to lift the harness because it's placed right on top of the 2 upper bolts for the valve cover. Then we've pulled the spark plug wires off of the locating looms that are mounted on the side, and then we're also going to have to take a short Phillips screw head out of the side of the valve cover because that holds the dipstick for your engine oil check. So that actually that'll have to come out, otherwise you'll have to try to pull the dipstick. Usually use a short stubby Phillips. I'm going to move the tube out of the way. Get a good bite. Unfortunately what happens is because you got oil seeping out of the valve covers, it also gets up into this screw, so they generally come out without much of a fuss. Keep your hands on it, and as you can see, that's a relatively small screw. Place that in an area where you can find it when you're ready to put it back together. Now we're also, to help move the loom, we're going to want to move this connector out of the way. And underneath is basically two arms that come off of a single pin that hold it in place. So if you have a 90-degree needle nose, it makes it much easier, and you're just going to squeeze those two little tabs together and lift up, and that'll move that out of the way. Alright, now the harness is held in place by a bracket attached to it, held by two bolts that are down in the lower intake, and these are 5/16 or 8mm. You can use either. And we need to take those out so we can lift the harness up and out of the way. These are relatively loose too. These work very well. So we'll get those backed off. And this way we'll have access to the upper bolts on the valve cover. Now, the valve cover bolts are also two different sizes. You have two shorts up top, two long ones on the bottom. And the heads of the bolt are an 8mm 12 point, which means you're not going to be able to put a 6-point socket on these bolts. You can use a 12 point, or as I've seen now, we've got what they call a gear drive, which will accept 12 point, 8 point, 6 point, and even fairly rounded out screws, and a gear drive. So I use an 8mm 12 point. I like the flexible head because it gives me a little better access in some areas that are tight. And all you're going to do is run those screws out. And you're going to be surprised because they're going to be relatively loose when you first get on them. What's happened is the gasket has become heated and compressed, basically taking the sealing properties away from the valve cover and the bolts. And this is why they leak. Okay, there's your two top. That's your bottom bolt, so you can see the difference in length. Keep that in mind when we reassemble, and we'll mention that as we get into reassembly. Okay, set our tools aside, save our bolts. Now if you look right in Land Rover's service manual, they actually recommend replacing these bolts when you change the valve cover. The reason being is, as original equipment, they put a dab of thread lock on them, which also comes on the new bolts. They don't get torqued hard enough to really stretch the threads. If you want to save the bolts, you can put some thread lock on them when you put them back together, but that's going to require cleaning of both the bolt and the holes. Or you can replace the bolts, come with the proper thread lock on them, and you can torque those down and they'll hold. Now we got our 4 bolts out. We have our snorkel out of the way. We have our dipstick disconnected. Spark plug wires removed from the looms, and the harness up and out of the way. Should be able to just break it loose with a pop. And there's your valve cover. You can see actually oil changes were done on a pretty regular basis on this. No heavy buildup. Some varnish, considering that the engine is 14-15 years old, and actually very clean. But the gasket's very hard, fully compressed. Now take a note, just a note, in these valve cover gaskets there are little metal spacers, and they're there so that when you tighten the screws down you don't completely crush the gasket. But every once in a while you'll pop these off, and if they've got a heavy varnish buildup, these little barrels will stick in the valve cover and sometimes even drop into the head. So if you're not aware that they're there, you may end up putting the valve cover back on with those barrels in there. So when you pull it off, account for all 4 spacers and make sure nothing's left inside. So we have all 4 on this gasket. We're just going to place this aside. Alright, so now we switched over to the passenger side. And as I mentioned earlier, we've already removed the heater hoses, which would run right across the top of this and then up into the heater core. So then that's relatively just unclamp and move. And we pre-drain the system. You can refer back to our video on the hose kit for this same vehicle, and that will show you how to remove the heater hoses and also how to drain the system rather easily as opposed to pulling the lower radiator hose. So where we are now is, next step will be PCV hose. We're going to take this off because it's going to come off with the valve cover, and show you 2 things that you need to check. On many of these will plug up. If this plugs up, what you do is essentially lose your vacuum to the PCV system, losing crankcase ventilation. The other thing that likes to go on these is right on the elbow of this hose. They become soft and mushy, and this cracks and splits and creates a vacuum leak. And you can see the poor condition that this one is in. And we're going to replace that hose as well. So this one is going to just go in the garbage. Now, something else I'll touch base on. It looks like somebody tried to remove it and broke it already, because this would have a little stub on the end of it. This is a plastic oil separator, essentially your PCV valve, and is mounted right in the valve cover on this passenger side. In most cases, they're usually locked in place because from the factory they install them all the way into the valve cover and then crimp the top slightly to lock it into place. So taking the other one out can be a bit of a problem. I find the best way is we're going to remove the valve cover. We're going to drill that right out of there using I believe it's a 21/32 drill bit. That'll clean out the whole chamber. We blow it out with compressed air. We install the new one, and then just put a slight crimp to also lock that in place. But trying to do it on the vehicle and you start breaking it up, pieces are going to fall down. It's much better to do off the vehicle. So next step, as you can see, the fuel lines run directly over the top of the valve cover, so we're going to need to remove those. The hose in the back has got 2 9/16 or 14 millimeter fittings on both sides. One is going to spin, the other isn't. And because this is your pressure side, you are going to have some pressure held in that system, so you want to put a rag or one out. We've already drained this, so we're not going to do that at this point. There'll be a little bit of dripping. But bottom line is, if you're doing this shortly after running the vehicle, you want to tuck some rags in and whatnot because you are going to spill some gas. And lay a rag over the top or wear safety glasses, because what will happen under pressure is it's going to squirt some fuel. Okay, we're going to back this off. Always a little test wiggle, make sure most of the other pressure's been relieved. And we move the line. This one, the return line, because it has relatively much lower pressure in it, only requires a clamp and hose setup. We've already loosened the clamp. And we'll grab that with a pair of pliers and crack it loose. Slide that off and take that out. And we'll move those up and out of the way. We've uncoupled our spark plug wires from the harness looms down the end. There's no screws or anything else to be disassembled from the bottom. And just as we did on the left side, we're going to have to lift the harness to access the upper bolts, and in this case we're also going to have to disconnect this front bolt, which will allow us to move this tube slightly up and out of the way. There is a bracket down below with a bolt on it that also holds this in place, but that bracket is bendable, which we're going to have to do, otherwise you'll be removing the AC compressor, the alternator, and the mounting bracket just to get to that bolt. We'll show you that in just a minute. So let's unbolt the harness. And again, 5/16 or 8 millimeter. Should be able to lift the harness up a bit. We'll be able to access the top bolts. We're going to take this retainer nut out right here for the heater hose tube. 10 millimeter on the nut. Alright, as you can see, we take the bolt out, and it gives us a little bit of clearance, but not a lot and probably not enough to lift the valve cover off. So we're going to take a pair of water pumps, and we'll get on this bracket, and we can bend that up and out of the way. It's bendable steel, it'll hold up, and then when we put it back together, we're just going to bend it right back down in the proper position. But now that gives us enough clearance, we should be able to get the valve cover out of there. So, let's take the upper and lower bolts out. Well, looks like in this case it's got the Lucas cables. We're going to have to disconnect the spark plug wires just to give us enough clearance in the back so we can move this around. Now again, looks pretty clean. And we're going to scrape this down and just make sure we got a good clean dry surface when we put it back together. And here's your gasket. And again, keep tabs, look for those little 4 barrels. Should be one in each hole. If you see one missing, make sure you look carefully on inside the head and on the base. We actually, when we pulled the other side, we actually found a spare barrel down in there left by the last person that put the valve cover gaskets on. So there you have it. We got both valve covers off. We have the upper intake off. And actually, with the coolant system drained for the heater hoses, now would be a good time to check all your radiator hoses and your bypass hoses. Anything there that needs to be done, now's the time to do it. So we're going to get the valve covers cleaned up. In this case, I think we're going to paint them up and make them look pretty, along with the upper plenum. So when we're done with that, we'll get back to reinstalling this. Alright, so now we're going to put our valve covers back on. Now, what we've done, in this case, we've painted this up. We want to make it look good. What I use is these Scotch-Brite pads. You can get them in the medium, coarse, or fine. I like the medium. Some of the fine and very fine, but either or, they're really nice for doing aluminum heads and cleaning up the area because they don't scratch up the aluminum, but they do get the built-up varnish and whatnot off. You can put a little bit of solvent on it or whatever, and that will clean that out. And you can do the same thing with the inside of the valve cover because we definitely want a nice, clean area so that our gasket's going to stick well. And what we've also done, just to make it a little easier on the installation, is I've applied a thin coat of high-tack all the way around the gasket, and we'll let it set up for a few minutes, get good and tacky. You're going to notice that on one side of the gasket there is a ridge all the way around the outside, and that's made to sit around this outer lip of the valve cover. Now, you also notice that 2 holes are closer together than the other 2. So you want to take note of that when you go to put your gasket on so that all your holes line up. Okay, we'll set that in place. Push that ridge around the lip of the valve cover. Get a nice even seal all the way around. And what this will do is when you flip the valve cover over and you're maneuvering it in here, the gasket's not flopping out of place. You can almost guarantee a good seal when you're done. Okay, so filler tube in the front. Just for a little extra support, we'll get our fingers around the middle. Gently slide that back and get around the wires and the lines. Again, keep an eye on your gasket to make sure nothing drops out. You can see a little bit of the gasket all the way around that lip. Okay, so we're in place. Now, if you remember when we took it apart, we mentioned there are 2 short bolts, 2 long bolts. Short bolts are going to go on top, long bolts on the bottom. You can wiggle the valve cover around a little bit and you'll feel the bolt drop down into the hole. Okay, and those bolts are 8mm 12 point. once you've got one started, don't tighten it all the way, because we want to have a little wiggle room to line up the others. There we go. I'm going to go about halfway down. Halfway down. Do yourself a small favor, is get the lower one started before you do the uppers, because if you need to, you can always lift the valve cover up a little bit to see that short bolt and where it lines up and where it's supposed to go. But usually once you have the first three in, it's just a little bit of maneuvering to get that last one started. What you're going to do then is start in the back. Snug it, just snug it all the way around. And then start back and tighten them down. Now, you don't have to worry about over tight. You don't need to get on them real hard, but you can snug them right in, because you have those little spacer in there in the gasket itself to keep you from crushing the gasket. Okay, so valve cover's in, and then essentially we're just going to do the same thing to the other side. Clean it up, a little bit of high tack, put the gasket in place, slide it in, and lock it down. Okay, so we have our valve covers in place. Just as we replaced the driver's side, we put the passenger side on, same procedure. And now we're going to install the upper plenum. I put a thin bead of Right Stuff, which you can use any good black RTV. Do a nice thin coat all the way around. Wait about maybe 10 minutes, let it get a little tacky. We find adhesion works a lot better that way. And I'm going to grab a couple bolts so that we can line things up. And we're going to set it in place. And we'll set this right on top. Alright, once we have the two corners started, we should easily be able to drop the others in. It should line right up. Just remember, this one closer to the throttle body gets the big long bolt. Alright, tighten them down good from the middle. Work to the outside. We get our clamp for our small hose that goes to the intake manifold. Okay, that's good and tight. And we have our two connectors. Hold them up. One for your idle air control module and one for the throttle body position sensor. Bring that up till you hear your click. And same with the other. Okay, those are in. And we have the two quick connects. And then on the driver's side, we have the small Phillips that holds the dipstick tube. Reinstall our breather hose. We're going to leave the tube off just for a few minutes because we need to put the two bolts back on for this support bracket for the tube, and the throttle cable and the transmission kickdown cable. Now, when we backed off the front screw to remove this kickdown cable, we didn't move the backs, and this is what actually sets the adjustment. So when we run this back in, you can just run this nut in till it snugs in and locks down, and the adjustment will remain the same as it was before we took it apart. Set that aside, and let's get the bracket on. Okay, bracket's on. And cable more towards the bottom will be the kickdown cable, so we do that one first and then slowly work our way up. Alright, so now we have our transmission throttle kickdown installed in the bracket. The nuts run in, we got that tight. We've clipped it onto the linkage. Now we're going to do our throttle cable, and that just sneaks up through the bracket. Simply push that on until it locks in. Put our pin through. And remember, this was a little tough getting out, so it was a little tough going in. Put our cotter pin in place. Okay, now we put on the intake tube. I want to make sure it's fully seated, so we're just going to snug it just to get it close. You can see we still have a little gap right there. Alright, so now we're over here at the passenger side, and before I go any further, I did want to mention one item that we didn't cover was make sure you plug in the vacuum line to the fuel pressure regulator. That's just a small nipple right on the back side. So now we're pretty much done with the driver's side. Now we're going to go over to the passenger side. We're going to reinstall the bolts that held our wiring harness down. And that was just two small bolts. 8mm heads, and you're just going to run them in and snug them. Okay, so now we get to that little oil separator. This little bitty right here, what we've done is drill this out with a 29/32 drill bit. That just basically drilled that right out to the base, to the bottom. That's going to be installed with the spigot end down. It's pretty much just going to drop right in there. And then we're going to peen over so that it can't come out of there. Install a new hose. And again, this was a hose you really need to check out when you go to disassemble this. These are really susceptible to creating vacuum leaks. Alright, so we're going to put the pressure line back on the fuel. That's the one in the back, 2 9/16 wrenches, and you can use 14mm. Hold the hose side stationary, use the nut on the line, on the hard line, to tighten. You hear a little snug crack, you know you're locked right in. And we put the return line back on. Okay, so fuel line's back on. We've got our PCV line on. We've replugged in our spark plugs, and last but not least, we'll replace the 2 heater hoses, and we're good to go. So that's pretty much changing over the valve cover gaskets on your GEMS engine, Discovery 1, Defender 90, Classic, and 96 to early 99 P38 full-size Range Rover. So when you're ready to get yours redone, and over a period of time you will do these on a regular basis on these, just by design. Every 3-4 years they usually need a valve cover gasket changeover. So again, when you're ready to do so, call any of our knowledgeable salesmen, 1-800-533-2210, and thanks for watching.